It's such a great pleasure to be here today. I have such admiration for Dr. Gold and all the speakers today, and I want to thank Dr. Ammerling for inviting me to speak with you today. So here I was 45 years ago when I began studying the brain as an undergraduate. Over the next 40 years, I became a VA career scientist. I received millions of dollars of funding, primarily for my work on PTSD and Alzheimer's disease from all these federal organizations and drug companies. But things changed for me, and I hope you'll be kind. I'm going to show you a picture of me in the 1990s. So things went awry a bit with my I'm not sure what's worse, actually, those awful glasses that I wore then, or my burgeoning belly. This is one of the before pictures, and here's an after. So not only had I gained weight, but I was at very high risk of developing heart disease. I had extremely high levels of triglycerides. Triglycerides are the way the body stores fat. And when that body stores fat, leaving the triglycerides in your blood, that's very harmful. So you get thick blood, you're more likely to have a heart attack and a stroke. I also had extremely high LDL cholesterol. That's the bad cholesterol. So this is a dangerous combination in which people are at very high risk for developing heart disease. And this was a problem because as I looked around to see, well, what should I eat? What do I do about my cholesterol? This is what I'm bombarded with. I knew a lot about the brain, but I didn't know which of this was right and maybe which was wrong. I mean, should I now start eating Cheerios and have oatmeal, even though I think they taste like cardboard, but they say it'll lower your cholesterol. And obviously, cholesterol is such a great concern. So now I've got to eat all kinds of foods. I've got to eat beans, and I've got to worry about saturated fat, being animal-based fat. And so this is the message that I was looking at the time. So as a scientist with a background in biology, I decided that I should use my education rather than just follow my doctor's urgent advice that I take a statin and other medication. And so I've made this now my second career. And this is just one of the presentations I've given in which I've learned about cardiovascular disease, and I've learned about dietary guidelines. And I've learned that basically we have been deceived. We have been given misinformation. And that in this brief period of time today, I'm going to share that with you. One thing that I did learn that was rather important was the reason why I had high triglycerides was because our liver converts our blood sugar to triglycerides. It's really very simple. So I was patting myself on the back because I was eating the bread but not putting butter on it. Well, as it turns out, it was the bread that was causing my high triglycerides. So that was easy. I could lower my triglycerides by cutting back on the carbs. But I had and I continue to have extremely high cholesterol. So I learned that this is all wrong. Absolutely everything you see here, fear of cholesterol, fear of animal fats, is absolutely all wrong. So I'm going to address how it is we have ended up having that unfounded fear of animal-based fat and protein, as well as our fear that cholesterol is going to be blocking our arteries. So it really begins in the story with a fellow named Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys was a professor who had no training in heart disease, nutrition, or epidemiology. He went to Italy on a sabbatical, and he saw that the people in Italy were thin, they had a low rate of heart disease, then decided everybody should eat like Italians, which is almost no meat, eat beans, eat lean meat, and olive oil. And he published a paper in a minor hospital journal, but it had a profound impact. And so what you have here, there are data from 22 countries, and you are seeing the results of the 5 countries which you're looking at the amount of fat that people consume in relation to death from heart disease. And I don't see the pointer, so I'm going to go without the pointer. But as you can see, this line increases with more fat in the diet, more heart disease, and Americans being at the absolute top. So Americans eat the most fat, Americans have the most heart disease. This is why Ancel Keys promoted the idea that fat, and ultimately saturated fat, animal fat, causes heart disease. Here's the problem. As I said, he had data from 22 countries. He picked data from 6 countries to create this graph. People knew it at the time, and even now people are apologizing for Ancel Keys, coming up with some reason as to why he would show data for only 6 countries. Well, they challenged him at the time. And so here's a paper that published in 1957 that showed Keys' figure. And they said Keys provided no information as to why he selected these 6 countries. So we're going to look at all 22 countries and see how it looks. And here it is. It is I'm actually pointing to this. You can't see it, but I'm pointing to it. It is a random scatter. There are countries where people have a high amount of fat with a low rate of heart disease, a low amount of fat, and a high rate of heart disease. The authors concluded that the suggested association between fat in the diet and death rates cannot be accepted as valid. So Ancel Keys is revealed as a fraud. He made up this finding, and he promoted the idea that eating too much fat will raise your cholesterol and give you heart disease. Okay. So you would think a scientist shown to be a fraud would never be heard from again. Climb under a rock and you're gone. Okay. Well, not so. Ancel Keys was now seen as a powerful force guiding American dietary research. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine in 1961. He was on the board of directors of the American Heart Association, despite, again, having no expertise in heart disease or nutrition. He was the expert in America on heart disease and nutrition. And what did he say in this article? Americans eat too much fat, especially saturated animal fat. It increases your cholesterol, damages your artery, produces coronary disease. So you've got to control your cholesterol to reduce your fat to almost no animal fat. And he stated this as a fact. There was no science to justify this statement. He made it up. There was no research to support these conclusions. But once this idea took hold, then people started fearing animal fat. The government got behind this as well, and so did the American Heart Association, which was sponsored by Procter & Gamble, which made margarine, which is why they still recommend margarine over butter, because they're supported by the margarine industry. So what have we ended up with? When you go on a diet, what are the foods you look at now? You've got fat-free cheese, and fat-free, almost all the yogurts, fat-free yogurt, and cholesterol-free eggs, and I can't believe it's not butter, fat-free butter. I can't believe people eat this crap. Imagine that, fat-free butter. The American Heart Association recommends lean meat, low-fat, skim milk. And remember, it's the carbohydrates that increases your triglycerides, which are stored as fat. And look at these cookies. Fat-free cookies. Isn't that fantastic? It's like it's a health food because there's no fat. It's pure sugar. And so fat was demonized, beginning with Ancel Keys and then promoted by the US government. So the sugar industry was able to add to this by paying off the leaders to promote the idea that fat, particularly animal fat, is harmful. And so what happened? As a result of dietary guidelines that demonized fat and minimized the influence of sugar, you then had fat Americans. Beginning with the 1970s, when the government was recommending that people eat 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrates a day. That was the food pyramid. You're supposed to have cereal and bread and all forms of carbohydrates every day. That's the base of the food pyramid. And when people started eating more carbohydrates without fat, you see Americans, adults got obese, and that has just continued on, and children became obese as a result of this fear of fat, so therefore more carbohydrates are consumed. So I've just briefly touched on this topic. There is so much more that you should understand about how we have been misled in the dietary guidelines. And so there are recent books that I highly recommend, some really nice work by Nina Teicholz, Questionable Link of Saturated Fat to Heart Disease. There simply is no evidence to link animal fat or animal protein consumption to heart disease. And you can see this here as well in this quote from her article. And I highly recommend these books by Zoe Harcombe, Nina Teicholz, and Gary Taubes. And they give you the skinny on what really is the kind of food that's recommended to make you well. So we just talked about food. Now what about in your blood? You've got to lower your cholesterol, right? This is what my doctor demanded of me 20 years ago, because cholesterol clogs our arteries. We need to get that cholesterol as low as possible, so we take medication, or we eat beans, or we eat oatmeal to lower our cholesterol. And we take medication to lower our cholesterol so that we'll be able to live heart attack free. Well, let's look into that. Here's what the experts say. If you have high cholesterol, you get into this red zone. The red zone is where you're going to have a heart attack or a stroke or you'll die. And so the red zone for people with high cholesterol, which is not reduced with medication, means you're going to die prematurely in your 20s, 30s, or 40s. And that is why people with very high cholesterol must control their cholesterol, according to these experts, which, by the way, are very well paid by the pharmaceutical industry. Coincidental? We'll see. So I'm just briefly going to cover some of the literature that's contradictory to what I just told you. So it's been known for decades that people with extremely high cholesterol, in this case called familial hypercholesterolemia, these are people who are born with extremely high cholesterol because of a genetic anomaly. And from 1966, and there are papers before this as well as after this, they say there's no evidence that people with FH have a shorter lifespan. That in fact, men and women, and we're talking cholesterol 300, 400, 500, live into the 7th and 8th decades. And I picked this paper just to show you that it's been known for 60 years that people with extremely high cholesterol have a normal lifespan. We'll even go into the 80s and 90s. People in their 80s. This is not familial hypercholesterolemia. These are just the people in the population that have the highest cholesterol. And when you look at their death rates, they're on the left, that's death from cardiovascular disease, extremely high to extremely low cholesterol, and you see no difference. So the cholesterol is not killing them young from having a heart attack or stroke. But now let's look at death from cancer in the middle. The people with the low cholesterol are in that dotted line, and they're dying at a higher rate. than the people with high cholesterol, which is the solid line at the bottom. And we look at death from infection on the right. The people with low and moderate cholesterol are dying at a higher rate than the people with the highest cholesterol at the bottom. We're talking about people in their 80s and 90s now, which you're not even supposed to get to if you have extremely high cholesterol. So something's clearly wrong here. And if you look at total rate of death, all-cause mortality, the dashed line shows the people with the lower cholesterol, and they're dying at a higher rate than the people with the lower cholesterol. And this should really surprise everyone because you've been told basically that cholesterol is toxic, that it'll kill you young, and you've been deceived. There is no evidence that high cholesterol will cause premature death. We published a paper in which we reviewed every paper published on mortality in elderly people, and elderly being over 65. And so in this systematic review, I worked with all these MD clinician scientists. We reviewed every paper ever published on death rate for people who are at the prime time to die of a heart attack or stroke. And we came to the conclusion, we did not find a single study that showed that people with the highest cholesterol were dying at a higher rate than those with the lowest cholesterol, concluding that elderly people with high LDL live as long or longer. The majority of the studies showed people with high LDL live longer than those with low LDL. So we should be questioning the validity of the cholesterol hypothesis, that being that cholesterol is inherently harmful. So let's look at what actually does cause harm. In this study, you've got people with a range of LDL, okay? LDL being supposedly the bad cholesterol. And we're looking at the triglyceride to HDL ratio. Again, triglycerides really are harmful when they're high. You'd like for your triglycerides to be below 100, ideally. And so when that ratio of triglyceride to HDL is closer to 1, that's very good. When that ratio is over 3, that's bad. My ratio, by the way, 25 years ago was 25, okay? So that's why it was really bad, which I've been able to reduce dramatically. But let's look at the rate of heart attacks. The people who have the good ratio, being less than 1.7, had a low incidence of heart attacks, about 4%. People with a high ratio, triglyceride, think about triglyceride as fat. More fat in their blood, higher ratio, far more heart attacks, 3 times more heart attacks. That's why the triglyceride HDL ratio is so important. You want your HDL high, that's the good cholesterol. You want your triglycerides low. This is in people, all of whom had their LDL below 170. Now let's look at the people who had sky-high LDL, far higher than 170, and we look at their incidence of heart attacks. It's no different than the people with low LDL. The people who had the good ratio are at about the same, 4%, and the people who have the bad ratio are at about 12%. The LDL is irrelevant. There is no reason to lower your LDL. It's the triglyceride to HDL ratio that is crucial. But of course you'll say to me, but I'm on a statin, and my doctor said now I'm protected from having a heart attack, and statins lower LDL, and they are the wonder drugs. So look at this ad. This woman is so happy because her doctor's got her on Crestor, and yes, lower my LDL, I'm not gonna have a heart attack. And she says right there, I've lowered my risk of a heart attack by 54%. And that's huge. You'll feel really protected. Well, this is the study that came to come to that conclusion that you lower heart attack rates by 54%. Published in The Lancet, major medical journal. Leader of that study was Dr. Paul Ridker. And there is the 54%. So overall, 44% of events, 54% reduction in heart attacks. They're not making up these numbers. And when your doctor sees this, that's why the doctor enthusiastically says, You need to be on Crestor because you're going to reduce your risk of having a heart attack. What I do is I actually read these papers. I go beyond the summary. So let's slip that aside, and I'm going to show you the actual data in this study. And this is the study that got Crestor FDA approval. Okay, you are looking at the percent of people that did not have a heart attack given either Crestor or placebo. So Crestor in red, placebo in blue, percent of people that did not have a heart attack. And I drew that line across there because that's 99%. More than 99% of the people did not have a heart attack in both groups. I just want you to stare at that because you got to see 50. Anybody see 54% there? And this is the look I'm getting. Okay. And it's like, seriously, I wasn't born yesterday. I know 54%, and that, sir, is not 54%. But it is. The difference between the red and the blue is a 54% reduction in the Crestor group. Are you ready for this? So the actual numbers, out of almost 18,000 people, less than 100 had a heart attack. I like to say these people were terribly uncooperative. Almost nobody had a heart attack. And that's what this study was designed to look at. So 31 people in the Crestor group had a heart attack. That is 0.35%. Only 68 people in the placebo group had a heart attack. That is 0.76%. Still, you say, where's the 54%? If you take 0.76 and you subtract 0.35, you get 0.41. 0.41 is 54% of 0.76. That's how they come up with a 54%. That's why he put 54% there. Do you think Paul Ridker wants to put in that you're reducing your risk of heart attack by only 0.4%? Instead, he put 54% there. And this is what got Crestor FDA approval. And this is how Crestor has generated billions of dollars in revenue because of the 54% number. The real difference is less than 0.5%. You go to your doctor and you say, what's my real risk of having a heart attack if I don't take my Crestor? And your doctor really should say, you have a 99.6% chance of not having a heart attack if you don't take the medication. So now, instead of being quizzical, you should be angry, like Barry. How many people here are either on a statin or know someone on a statin? We got a lot of hands up, okay, and all around for people watching. And so this is now the way you should be thinking. This is the way you should approach your doctor. Because what you do now is ask about the number needed to treat, NNT. And you go to your doctor and say, what's the NNT of Crestor? That'll really surprise your doctor. So you've been listening to Dr. Google, haven't you? What's the NNT of Crestor? NNT is how many people need to take Crestor for one person to have one less heart attack, and that's 220. 220 people need to take Crestor for one of those 220 to have one less heart attack. That's how incredibly ineffective these drugs are. So we go back to this lady who was just so excited to be on Crestor. And instead of saying, I'm lowering my risk by 54%, oh, I'm actually lowering my risk by 0.4%, less than 1%. So that's the real finding. And this is how you've been deceived. What they do is it's called relative risk. You can amplify the benefit by using what's called relative risk. The real difference is called absolute risk. And this is what you want to know about your medication. So you might think, okay, have I taken the worst study of all, the only study in which statins are not too effective? No. What you find here in this study is the real difference, almost no mortality benefit, almost no myocardial infarction, almost no stroke. So the real benefit is almost zero by this group that evaluated all of the statin studies. And they said most people who took the statins had almost no benefit. Still, it's 1%. That's better than nothing if it didn't have the adverse effects. And so from the FDA, you see all the different adverse effects of the statins: liver damage, diabetes, memory loss, muscle injury. And they're in the medical journals. All the adverse effects: reduced testosterone, erectile dysfunction, kidney disease, muscle atrophy, and there's more. Cataracts, renal failure, liver dysfunction, published in peer-reviewed medical journals. These drugs cause harm for almost no benefit. I'll just take one example. The American Heart Association reviewed the adverse effects of statins and came to the conclusion that they can cause non-serious, reversible forgetfulness. Can you imagine you take medication and it causes you to become forgetful, and your doctor says, well, that's not serious. I think it's pretty serious myself. So look at this study. These are 75-year-old people, men and women, who all had memory problems. They went to their doctor, they're diagnosed with dementia, okay? And these authors, this published over 10 years ago, said statins can impair cognition because statins get into the brain and interfere with the brain's ability to make cholesterol. And you need cholesterol to make memories. And what happened was they discontinued their statins. All the people in this study took away the statins, tested their memory a month later, no dementia at all. The dementia was gone. And the critical manipulation was, for all these people, they now put them back on the statin, dementia returned. Impaired memory returned. So think about this. We have an epidemic of Alzheimer's disease in this country. We have millions of people taking statins. We don't know how many of those people actually have a functioning brain. It's just being interfered with by the statin that they're taking. So in summary, I have written this with two outstanding co-authors. I've written a paper with two co-authors in which we explicitly state, do not take statins if you have a good ratio of triglycerides to HDL, no matter how high your LDL is. If you have a poor ratio, get it down. The way to improve your ratio is to cut back on carbohydrates. If you do that, you will lose weight, you'll naturally lower your blood pressure and your blood sugar. You won't need to be on a statin. There is a slight concern that you could have excess clotting, and there are strategies to reduce clotting, but ultimately you do need to be concerned about excess clotting. And there are potential medications or supplements such as nattokinase, which can potentially reduce clotting. So we want to be aware that clotting can cause disease. LDL does not cause disease. So I've got chapters in these books, which I highly recommend for more information. I love the title of that one, Fat and Cholesterol Don't Cause Heart Attacks and Statins Are Not the Solution. These are MDs that have written chapters and PhDs have written chapters in all these books. So I highly recommend them if you want to look further into this topic. So I thank you, and I don't know if we have time for questions, but thank you for your attention.